No.
మన ఊళ్ళో మధ్యాహ్నం 12 గంటల నుంచి 10 గంటల తినాలి డెసిషన్ ఏం చేయలేదు పట్టిన కూర్చున్నాం ఓన్లీ
Krishnaveli, could you please mute your mic?
చూస్తున్నాం
Madam, shall we start the program, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
I welcome all the teacher educators, students who are on online, YouTube, and all the teacher educators from all over Telangana state. Today we have participants from Usmania University and other 5 state universities, that is Mahatma Gandhi University, Shatavahana University, Palamuru, Telangana. All state universities are also participating today on the second day of workshop on IKS, Indian Knowledge System. So I welcome all the teacher educators, and I think we have even 2 participants yesterday I could see from engineering college. So if they are on the online, I welcome you all. Welcome you both and other, if any, from engineering colleges. And then I welcome all the student fraternity who are watching this program on YouTube link, because we were worried like the participant may exceed and then the students may be unable to attend this particular IKS workshop, because basically we have started with the keeping in view of the teacher educators and the students at large. So I welcome all the teacher educators from Usmania University jurisdiction and other state universities. I welcome you all for the second day workshop on Indian Knowledge System. We are collaborating with Anadi Foundation. I welcome you all once again. And now I request my colleague, Dr. J. Lalita, Assistant Professor, Department of Education, Usmania University, to introduce the resource person. I welcome you both, ma'am, Tisha Vashishta and Shyam Krishna Kumar Garu. I welcome you both for the second day workshop on Indian Knowledge System. Namaste to all and all the participants and the teacher educators. Now I request my colleague to introduce the resource person.
Namaste to all. This is Lalita from Department of Education, and it's my honor and privilege to introduce today's resource persons of this session. Shyam Krishna Kumar and Titiksha Vasisht are the founders of the Pranava Institute. They're also volunteers at Anadi Foundation. The Pranava Institute works at the intersection of emerging technology, public policy, and society from an India first perspective. We help organizations, Pranava Institute help organizations stay ahead of the curve of all the things tech policy through research, strategic insight, and capacity building. Mr. Shyam is a computer science graduate and holds a master's in political science with a specialization in international relations. Titiksha holds a master's in political science and international affairs too. She is a 2022 awardee of the University of Notre Dame, IBM's Tech Ethics Lab, wherein she works on technology ethics in design. So, Shyam Krishna Kumar and Titiksha, we welcome you to this session, and now the platform is yours. Thank you very much. And today's session is on ancient Indian education system and Panchakosha development. Thank you.
Namaste, everyone. And thank you so much for that very wonderful introduction. Very, very privileged to be here. Unfortunately, Shyam Krishna Kumar will not be joining this session. So, yes, I believe we can begin. Before we start, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Osmania University and all the other state universities, teachers, participants, and students who are joining us through this Zoom link, but also on YouTube and watching this live. I'm very pleased that there is so much interest in understanding and learning more about Indian knowledge systems. And hopefully the session today will help you think more about it and learn a bit better. So before we start, perhaps we can all join our hands and do a small invocation. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om. Om Namah Pranavarthaya Shuddha Jnanekam Nirmalaya Prashantaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om. With salutations to Dakshinamurti, we start. I will just share my screen now. Yes. Is my screen visible? Please let me know through a thumbs up or. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let us begin today's session, which I have tentatively titled Glimpses into Ancient Indian Education System. I am Titiksha Vasisht, the resource person for the day, and very thankful to Anadi Foundation for giving me this opportunity to share. Now, let us get started. I want to open with a few questions for all of us in the room to discuss. The first is, do you think that ancient Indians were educated? When we think about the past, when we think about our ancestors, do we think that they were educated first? Second is, what are some characteristics of an educated society? Today, every year we see that the UNESCO releases something called the GEM report on education, trying to understand how different societies are making their education policies, how are they advancing the goal of education and human development in their particular countries and worldwide. And so when we see these many efforts that different states are taking to understand and propagate education, does it help us think about what it means for a society to be educated? And then the third is, how do we know about this past? How do we know about this ancient India? What are the sources on which we depend? Before we get into it, I would like to invite some comments from the participants in the room and what are their thoughts about the first two questions. So, do you think that ancient Indians were educated? And what are some characteristics of an educated society according to you? Please feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Lily G is saying on the chat that yes, they were educated. Anyone else wants to share what their understanding on this is?
Yes, that's why our India is shining today also.
Absolutely. That's a great point. What are some characteristics of an educated society? How do we know that people in a society are educated? If you had no degrees, certificates, what?
Well-mannered and educated.
Well-mannered and
And
educated.
disciplined and educated.
Well-mannered, disciplined, and educated. Absolutely. So how people conduct themselves or behave gives us a very good understanding of the level of education in a society. What else? Anyone else wants to share?
It is reflected in their way of life. It is reflected in their way they dress. It is reflected in the way shows that community. It is reflected in the way they documented all impact and the evidences of an educated society. According to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And this is precisely where what this session will explore today. So we will look at some of the sources of ancient Indian education, some descriptions of that education, and finally, what was the nature of education in ancient India. I request participants to please mute themselves throughout the session to avoid disruption. There are some questions which come to mind when we think about what is needed for an education to take place. Today, if you were to look at certifications or a license to start a university or start a school, there are fair bit of requirements, right? You need a certain amount of land, you need a certain amount of infrastructure, you need benches, you need tables, you need some technology as well to be able to set up a school for yourself. And that is what we like to think is the nama and rupa of education. But this is not always the case. The question we need to ask sometimes is, can education happen in different forms and styles? So can schools look different? Can centers of learning look different from each other than the singular homogenized way in which we think about schools and universities today? This picture of the person in the middle, we all know is Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda got his education. He was one of the earliest English graduates that India produced. He got a very modern education, in fact, right? But one can equally say that his education happened apart from his university, also in this picture, which is on the right of the screen, which is the Dakshineshwar temple of Kali in Bengal, right? So educational centers or places of education don't always have to look the same in nature. In fact, Swamiji once said that the education that you are getting, where he's talking about modern education, that the education that you are getting now has some good points, but it has tremendous disadvantage, which is so great that the good things are all weighed down. In the first place, it is not a man-making education. By man-making here, he means character-building education. Yesterday, some of you talked about the importance of moral and philosophical learning in education. And that is what he's also pointing to here. It is merely and entirely a negative education. A negative education or any training that is based on negation is worse than death. The child is taken to school and the first thing he learns is that his father is a fool. The second thing, that his grandfather is a lunatic. The third thing, that all his teachers are hypocrites. The fourth, that all the sacred books are lies. By the time he is 16, he's a mass of negation, lifeless and boneless. And the result is that 50 years of such education has not produced one original man in the 3 presidencies. Every man of originality that has been produced has been educated elsewhere and not in this country. Or they have gone to the old universities once more to cleanse themselves of superstition. So very poignantly in this quote, Swami Vivekananda talks about how, because modern education, especially at the time when the British ruled India, very much relied on telling a child that what their ancestors knew or know was not knowledge. And in fact, it extremely negated a lot of their own knowledge which was held by people, leading to a lack of originality in people. And with that context in the background, we start today with the historical sources of Indian education. Now, as I understand, yesterday you have had a brief introduction to the colonial period of education. What was Dharpal's beautiful tree? What records show to us about knowledge during colonial times? Today, however, we'll go a bit back. We'll go further back and think a little bit about ancient India. Now, how do we know about what education was in the ancient period? There are a few sources, and especially as educators who will face questions from from students who are always more curious, who want to know sources and where are you getting this information from. I'm sure when some of you talk about these things in class, this is a concern that comes up. So knowing our sources is a very, very important part of learning about the past. The first and most obvious source on ancient Indian education is manuscripts and textual sources. Right? So, according to some estimates, we have over 30 million manuscripts produced in what is India alone, which survive. So, several millions outside of these 30 million manuscripts are lost to time. And out of these 30 million which survive, and they are currently scattered in different parts of the world, only about 10,000 have been translated into English. So that's about roughly 1% of the total number of manuscripts that are available. These are Sanskrit manuscripts alone. We cannot compute the number of manuscripts totally if we were to also include regional languages in this particular point. So manuscripts and written sources of history are very, very crucial. A lot of ancient texts, for example, yes, sorry, I just went a bit back and forth. So manuscripts and textual sources are a very important source. Second is architecture and material evidence. We have so many temples, so many buildings, so many constructions which exist from ancient India right up to the present. So for example, the Ashokan rock edicts, which propagate dharma or dhamma when Ashoka turned Buddhist, are existing across the country. What does that tell us? That tells us that from the north all the way to the south and in the west of the country, there were literate populations who could read those rock edicts, which tried to tell people how to live or what were the new laws which needed to be followed in the polity. And finally, material evidences like pottery from the Harappan period also give us information about what was knowledge and what were different sources of knowledge and what did people learn. Right? Third is continuing institutions and their internal historical records. So institutional knowledge, for example, continues to survive. For example, there are texts on temple administration which we find in the Srirangam temple, for instance, and in other parts of the country, which are very strict codes on how a temple is supposed to be administered. So those institutional histories also give us a source of what learning was like. Fourth are granthas and texts which survive often begin by paying respects to their lineage. So even if we don't have direct manuscripts or sources for certain texts or they've become lost over time, we understand that in Ayurveda, for example, in Charaka Samhita, before the text begins, there is a tracing of the lineage about how this knowledge was passed down one after another. And that gives us the lineage of knowledge transfer which has happened over a long period of time. Aside from these, there are also personal records and biographies and pedagogies in practice. A very simple example of pedagogies which we have all encountered, I'm sure, are music and arts and crafts, right? Or clusters of craftsmen. So if you know that there are these special tile making techniques that happen in a particular village in Andhra Pradesh or in Karnataka, for instance, those are communities of practice which have been continuing these traditions for a long, long time. Lineages of makers, for example. There are families in New Delhi, very close to where I live, in fact, who have been making musical instruments for several generations. So even if there are no textual sources for this, we understand that people have learned these particular techniques and they carry on to the present. Temple records and practices, as well as city histories. So Kanchipuram, for example, and Sangam literature have a very close relationship, which is documented in the history of the city of Kanchi, right? Similarly, in ancient India, there was a professional class of historians who were called Suttas. And in Magadha was the empire set up by Chandragupta Maurya. they were called the Bhrigavangi Rasas, right? Who were the chroniclers of the royal dynasties. So they kept records of the kings from the ancient times and kept records of their lineages, their administration, how did they rule their empire, what were the qualities of people at that time, what was the economic status like, and so on. And finally, we also have homes and family traditions and lineages of learning. So unlike today, where we think that to gain an education, everyone needs to be sent to a school, this was not always the case, right? Learning happened, of course, in Gurukulas and Pathashalas, but it also happened very much at home, which could often be different or specialized in nature. So the home and school divide as we see today did not necessarily exist. Now, finally, I want you all to look at this particular slide and think. Look at these different material objects that we see. And there is a very strong inference possible when we do this. So if you look towards the leftmost picture here is a water reservoir which exists. And it's following from the Harappan times to this day. And it tells us that people had modes of creating and storing water, especially in times when they would possibly have dry weather, for instance. But the way it is constructed also shows us that they had a lot of knowledge about groundwater table, about how rainwater must be stored, how do we channel water, how do we create aqueducts that transport it, and finally, how do we do complicated brickwork to make sure that that water remains cool if that is what we desire. Similarly, you will see, of course, temples are a very obvious example of this particular idea, but also copper tools or the weight system which existed in the Harappan time. And finally, rightmost, you see Harappan pottery, which is beautifully glazed. And here you can see it has beautiful decorative carvings, etc. These are some of the most advanced materials from the ancient world which India produced. Now let us think about how did this even happen? These all have been existing. All the things on this particular page have come down to us from roughly 5,000 years ago. How were they made possible and what sort of education led to it? So when we think about ancient India, the period that we are talking about is roughly prehistoric. So prehistoric essentially means the period before we have writing and documentation available. So prehistoric to about 500 CE, which is when the Gupta Empire roughly ends. That period constitutes ancient India for most historians. What we know about education in ancient India is that Gurukulas and Pathashalas focused on building knowledge and samskaras of learners. So Gurukulams were extremely common and widespread all across the country, and so were Pathashalas. We also know that education was community supported. It happened by living with the Guru very closely, and that is why we also trace the roots of the Guru Shishya Parampara back to ancient India. So education happened by living with the Guru in their ashramas, and that is also why it is called a Gurukula. It is the family or the community centered around the Guru. The fact that there was no singular fees model, so it's not like every child who comes to the Gurukulam has to pay a particular amount, meant that education was community supported and also allowed autonomy and affordance to people across the section of society. Now, this means number one, that the teacher is not dependent on the fee model essentially to sustain themselves, right? It also meant that they cannot be controlled. So what should they learn or what should they teach was not dependent. It was not something that could be necessarily influenced. And then finally, it also created sort of a cross-sectional model in society, which means people who are coming from very rich classes or rich backgrounds were in effect cross-subsidizing education for those who were not coming from very well-to-do families. Right? There are documents which show that each village at least had a school, as you would have seen yesterday, at least in colonial times from William Adams' report. Now, I'm not saying that's ancient India, that's very much modern India. But let's remember that this modern India number which we have shows us that what was the state of the system when it was already in deep periods of decline. Hence, it showcases the social importance of education. Even at a time when India was economically going through a difficult time, education was considered a high priority for people. Clusters of villages had higher institutes of learning, which taught various advanced disciplines and skills. So, till a certain point, everyone had more or less similar education, which was fairly widespread. Many things were taught. But then there were also very focused, specialized clusters of learning, which taught advanced disciplines and skills. Now, there were many sides of education. Education did not happen in one single place. And we gain this knowledge, or we gain this understanding of where it happened from very diverse sources, from the Itihasas, Puranas, from traveler accounts, from textual sources, and so on. So we obviously know villages or gramas had primary and secondary education, but we also know that cities or nagaras were industrial centers and offered opportunities for skill-based learning for those who wanted. The Indian model of society was never two-tier. So unlike today, where we think that there is a rural and urban divide, so people live either in cities or they live in villages, this was not the case. There was a third site where people used to live, which was called aranyas or vanas, right? So forest, or loosely translated, these are forests. So forests or aranyas were also sites of production. And through various Puranas and Itihasas, we understand how they were so important to bring together people who were interested in similar pursuits or wanted to share knowledge, just the way we do in a conference today, right? So when you go to a particular conference, you want to meet other people who are doing work in those disciplines, etc. Naimisharanya, perhaps one of the most famous ones which we know till today. Kanva Ashrama, where Shakuntala is born and her son also is born. And then there were also Kulapatis, who can be understood as walking universities themselves. So teachers who were so learned that they did not need to stay in a particular place to teach. They would move around with their students across different parts of the country and carry with them all the knowledge that they required while learning on the go. The site of knowledge production was also the Aranya. So Rishikulas, like I said, can be seen as knowledge communities where many intelligent people or highly advanced integrated intelligence is revered and coming together, and not just focused on singular specialists. So today we think that a generalist has no place in our education system. Unless you are a PhD in a very specific discipline, you don't have advanced knowledge, right? But that was not always the case. In one way, if I may say so, the Rishi is the original teacher of the Bharatiya civilization because he has a highly advanced integrated intelligence of many things at once. There are, of course, city universities and university towns: Kashi, Mithila, Sharda Peetham, Kanchipuram, Melkote, Navadvipam. We've read about all of these in different places, and they also give us today continuing knowledge traditions of those times. Varanasi, for example, was fairly well known for medicine around Shushruta's time. Shushruta learned, in fact, in Varanasi. It's been a hub for classical music for centuries. The Kashi Vidvat Parishad, for instance, survives to this day. So as we can see, education did not just happen in a single school or a college, but there were many sites for this education. Now I have some questions for the room, which is, where do you think, or what did higher education according to you look like? Did we have universities? If yes, can you name some of them? What did they look like? What do you think they taught? Anyone? Did ancient India have universities that you've heard of? Please unmute and speak.
Hello, ma'am. This is Kiran Mai. I think Kakatiya University is one of the oldest university, no, ma'am.
Can you
Kakatiya
repeat?
University. Kakatiya University.
Kakatiya University, yes, absolutely. Nalanda and Takshashila, somebody is saying absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
Great. So we are fairly well aware that there were universities in ancient India. Right? They are not a new phenomena, unlike many different parts of the world, where universities only come up in the Middle Ages or in the new post 15th to 16th century, for example. Nalanda, Vallabhi, Takshashila, Vikramshila. Absolutely. Yes. Great. So what did higher education look like? And I bring this because many of us here in this room are concerned with higher education. We are working in the higher education sector. Vallabhi, Vikramshila, thank you so much for sharing your answers. So many universities and viharas, or the viharas were Buddhist centers of learning, existed in ancient India. These texts, both Sanskrit and Buddhist texts, are our sources for what these universities look like. Right? So some of these universities were Takshashila, Nalanda, Vikramshila, Odantapuri, and so on. Let's see a little bit about Takshashila. So Takshashila was one of the earliest universities in the world. That is a historical claim which has been made by several historians. It was a very important center of learning and provided its students with multidisciplinary education. So there was, of course, the predominance of Vedic and technical disciplines such as law, medicine, military science, right? The 18 Shilpas or the 18 arts, which included skills such as archery, hunting, elephant lore, were taught in addition to law, medical school, and military science. There were several notable alumni who we now know today, whose names have passed on in history, who were actually, or who all either learned or taught at Takshashila, right? So Mahabharata, for example, is narrated in what is considered Takshashila today by Vaishampayana, by lore. Chanakya, for instance, was a result of Takshashila. He was known to have learned there before he goes to Magadha or goes to Pataliputra and meets Chandragupta Maurya. Panini, who is known for, of course, the Ashtadhyayi most prominently, but Panini is one among a very long tradition of grammar which has existed in India for long. And Panini is also said to have learnt at Takshashila. Jivaka. Now, Jivaka is a very, very interesting example because Jivaka is said to have cured the Buddha once. So he was a physician to the Buddha when he was appointed in the court of Bimbisara. Bimbisara was the son of Chandragupta Maurya. And it is said that Jivaka was in fact, he learned for about 7 to 8 years under Rishi Atreya in the Takshashila University, where he was taught the science of Ayurveda. And he went on, of course, to serve Bimbisara in his court after having graduated from Takshashila. The very famous story of his graduation test, actually, some of you may be aware of. The story essentially is that when once Atreya believes that Jivaka has learned for a fairly long time, his test is to go around and find a herb or find a plant essentially, which has no use, which is useless. It has no purpose in healing or in any way it cannot help human beings. And when Jivaka goes for a long distance, in fact, not just around Takshashila, but he travels a fair bit across the northern parts of India and comes back very disheartened saying, I could not find a single herb which could be considered useless or without healing properties. And that is when Atreya calls him qualified. He says, you have understood the science of healing and you are now graduated out of this university. So Jivaka is of course considered very, very important, and we find information about Jivaka both in Buddhist as well as Sanskrit texts. An Aramaic description, which dates back to about 4th to 5th century, which was discovered from Takshashila, reports that the city was reputed as a university town, and it was known for the coaching of various disciplines of arts and sciences. 18 kalas we already saw. There are also records which show that about 104 princes were studying Dhanur Vidya or archery at the same time. So think about it. It's a university which, of course, has scholars in all these disciplines and in all the arts, but also royal families have 104 princes have been sent to this university to learn archery and different kinds of skills. It is also said that Takshashila had fairly coveted education, which means getting in was difficult, right? Today we think that getting into Cambridge or Harvard or IITs, IIMs, this is difficult. It was quite competitive to get into Takshashila as well, because it was considered to be very, very complete and holistic education that students received. Students came to Takshashila from far off places such as Kashi, Koshala, and Magadha. If you remember, today, what we call Takshashila would today fall in what is understood as northern Pakistan. So you can imagine how far away something like Magadha or even Koshala kingdoms could be, right? Magadha would be all the way in Bihar, for instance. So thousands of kilometers students would travel and take an arduous journey to undergo, to want to get to Takshashila because of the excellence of the learned teachers there, right, who were authorities in their subjects. The admission to Takshashila was not only limited to students belonging to the elite class or just students who were rich, but evidence also mentions that there were sons of kings, nobles, merchants, tailors, even fishermen getting university education. Takshashila, within quotes, stood as the main gate to India, connecting her with the rest of the world. Think about it. Today, we are so proud when somebody comes and visits, especially if you are in the academic circles. You are so proud when somebody from a university abroad comes to visit your institution and wants to see what is happening in your department, what is the research, etc. Fairly similarly, Takshashila was a main gate. It was also the capital of the Gandhara kingdom at that time and a very important trade and commercial center. So people from all over the region, not just India, came to study at this university. Similarly, Nalanda. The records for how Nalanda was we get from Xuanzang, who was a Chinese Buddhist traveler. He traveled in India extensively. He learned at Nalanda and became so learned in the Indian traditions that he was asked to make a presentation in the court of Harshavardhana, who was a northern ruler, right? And it is Harshavardhana who essentially sponsors Xuanzang's travels back to China after he is done learning. So in Xuanzang's account, we find that in Nalanda, over 100 lectures in a day were taught. And there were about 1,500 teachers and over 8,500 students. Think about the teacher-student ratio here with this number. Again, entry to Nalanda was competitive. It was considered a very complete education. The age of students was around 20 on average, whereas students started university roughly around the age of 16. A Nalanda graduate was looked upon with a lot of admiration, given how great the education they received was, right? Another important thing to remember about both Takshashila and Nalanda is that they were land grant universities. So because they did not want to be dependent on a particular king or on a particular political head to make the university run, land grants which were essentially given in the name of the university to help them sustain for a long period of time, for learning to not be politically motivated, for learning to remain autonomous was made. So records show that revenues of over 100 villages were granted for Nalanda's functioning. And we will see in a minute what these what this money was used for. Similarly, somebody mentioned Vallabhi. So Vallabhi was also a very prominent university, which was known for its teaching in political science, and Niti Shastra, and business, and Varta. So a lot of Varta is essentially business and commerce. We know from records that in ancient India, trade was fairly prevalent, not just within the region, but also with other parts of the world. And so many merchants and traders sent their children to Vallabhi to learn the science of business and management. Right? We already covered how universities taught a wide array of things. Now, aside from these two universities for which we have extensive records, we also know that there were temple universities. So temples, because they were considered as very important centers of learning, of culture, of commerce, and the arts. Ujjain, for instance, the Ujjain temple, which is the Ujjaina Mahakalam temple, was said to have been a very important center of excellence in mathematics and astronomy. In fact, it is in Ujjain that Brahmagupta, who is considered a foremost mathematician. Could you please mute? Thank you. So we know that Brahmagupta continues the tradition of mathematicians and polymaths such as Vara Mihira in Indian mathematics lived in Ujjain. Similarly, did Bhaskaracharya, who was the composer of Leelavati, which is a very beautiful poetic mathematical text. And he is also the founder of proto-differential calculus. As we do more of these sessions, I'm sure you will come across some verses from Leelavati in this workshop. We know that in the northern parts of the country, the Sharada Peetham was considered to be a very, very important center of learning, which is why we understand, but that is why it is called a Peetham, or it had the title of Jnana Peetham, then people had attained to a very high degree of knowledge. Of course, there are records showing the Sharda Library and the Sri Bhashyam being composed there. Similarly, there were important centers which cultivated or had a culture. So think about these as centers of learning for very specific disciplines sometimes, and sometimes holding many, many networks of scholars, learners, and researchers together, right? These could be music, mathematics, astronomy, the arts, and so on. Now, higher education did not just happen in the university, it also happened outside, right? Several times. So it was not just your important centers of learning, but it is a very complex web which was woven all across the country. Teachers and students. So records from Nalanda tell us that teachers and students both came from many, many parts of the world to these ancient universities. So you had people coming in from China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, West Asia. Of course, India's boundaries were far more broader back then, right? So it stretched all the way from Afghanistan to what we consider Burma today. So much of what we today consider the South Asian region, in fact, was there was a lot of mobility in this particular region, especially for education and the teaching learning process. Xuanzang on the love of learning. So there are beautiful records. In Xuanzang's record, we see he talks about how there is a deep love of learning in India. And people, even if they are rich, they could be rich or poor, they give a lot of stress and attention on the act of learning itself. And that learning is so important that is also the root of why ascetics, or people who have probably in a traveler's eyes have nothing and keep moving from place to place, right? Hold up that love of learning for each other. Another thing we find in history is that there was remarkable mobility across all parts of the country. So it is not that if somebody went to a particular university or went to a particular Gurukulam, they would only stay in that particular place. Often travel would be a part of their learning exercise. So in Jivaka's example, we see Jivaka is sent away to find the herb, which is his final test, Similarly, children of merchants or people who could afford to give their children some extra money would often travel as a part of their learning experience. This mobility stays right up to the time of Subramanya Bharati, as we see. So economics, we just saw how Nalanda was given revenues of over 100 villages to sustain and run the university. This money was essentially used for both learners and teachers who were given food, clothing, bedding, and medicines free of cost. Think about it. Today, one of the largest challenges we have in education is sustaining revenues and costs, especially when it comes to higher education institutions and universities. Because of such a model, any student, even if they were coming from a very far off place, could be ensured that they will get basic food, clothing, and shelter, as well as medicine, regardless of when they have gone to study. Which is precisely why someone like Zuhan Zhang, who stayed in India for almost a decade, so he stayed in India for roughly 9 to 10 years, and he could be sure he's coming all the way from China into India, and he can be ensured that he will be taken care of, because when he gets admitted into Nalanda, all the basic things that he requires to live are essentially taken care of by the university. This allowed for learners to be free and for them to not worry so much about the earning aspect of education, which is another thing we worry about today, right? Today, we are constantly thinking about the return on investment on our education, right? What will I earn if I learn this? What job will I get if I invest my time in this particular knowledge? When you did not have so much tying up of knowledge to profession as well as knowledge to money inherently or dependence inherently, there could be greater opportunities for people to learn a more wide variety of things and a wide array of disciplines. Somebody asked about yes, about the kalas in the chat, and I think this is where their answer essentially is. So there are 3 kinds of things which also we can see here. So aside from, of course, disciplinary knowledge such as that of law or medicine, right? There were also other kinds of skill-based learning which were highly coveted and which were fairly commonplace. So learning agriculture, learning metallurgy, right? Metals were very, very important because India was considered to be a very important center between the 7th to the 12th centuries for all kinds of metal-based tools, instruments, for bronze items. So both for beauty, but also weapons for war, because we have been mining in India for a very, very long time. So India had the ability to make very fine metal, very fine copper, brass, and other kinds of alloys. Of course, silver and gold, but those were far more expensive. But the science of metallurgy was fairly advanced, as we understand, so much so that metallurgical exports from India between the 7th to 12th centuries have been found in many different parts of the world who could not make it themselves, right? So it was a very important export for us. Armor making, which is essential for war and security. Architecture, we have ample examples of architecture even today. So many buildings and temples and public works which stand the test of time. Charioteering, stone working, leather working, shipbuilding, right? These were skills that people learned, and these were also skills that people ended up getting educated and taking up as professions themselves. So Shrikant ji is saying logic, Vedic maths, right? Absolutely. So mathematics, of course, the Vedas definitely, and then logic or Nyaya, Vaisheshika, very important disciplines which were also taught. Aside from these, we also had Shrenis. So Shrenis were guilds of professionals or traders who worked together in a cluster sort of model. Right? So Shrenis, what did Shrenis do? It's essentially like a trader, or what you would understand as a guild today. So the guild model allowed for people who were from the merchant class to work and learn together in order to increase their business, right? in order to do better in their way. Similarly, we also, of course, we've already mentioned this, that travel as education was a very, very important idea, especially from those who came from wealthy families. Think about it. If a particular, if a son or a daughter of a particular royal family is coming to study, travel would be such an important source of education for them, especially if they are going to take up positions of power and governance as they grow older, right? So if they go around different parts of the country, see how different people live, what are the different kinds of things they do, what are the different things they learn, and so on. What are the lands like? What is the that would give them immense exposure, which would actually make them better at governance and would help them learn more, right? Now, there are some things that we understand from all this information that we have shared, and also some of the things that you learned in the session yesterday. It tells us something about the nature of education and learning itself. Very excellent point has been made in the chat, which says education used to satisfy the 4 objectives of human pursuit. Absolutely true, right? So education definitely was supposed to help fulfill the Purusharthas, which is Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. But what we see from all these different instances is that knowledge was also more interwoven and complex. It was not fragmented but integrated. What I mean by this is that today, when we think about knowledge and learning, we have certain binaries in mind. We think that science, for example, or mathematics, for example, is very, very different from music, or it's very, very different from the arts or the creative pursuits, right? But and you will see this in Leelavati and even in the way these texts were constructed themselves, that it was far more integrated than we thought, right? Cultivation of knowledge and skills often went together hand in hand. And knowledge was not just open for students. So it was not just for those who were between the ages of 3 to 18, and then after that they have to go to college. But learning by itself was something that society was engrossed in. So people at different ages or different points in their life could learn. Similarly, it was not a linear model that, oh, you enter and you exit. There were very many variations in how people gained this education. Some people stayed to learn for 7 years. Some stayed to learn for 12 or 13 years. Some learned for 5 years and then went back to their homes and started learning what was needed for them to run their business or take on, their family heritage skills, for instance. So knowledge was not limited to education, but society at large could access this learning. Right? Nobody would say that, oh, you've not learned, you don't have a certificate for this X subject, so now you can't learn Y. Right? We also have sources which tell us about apprenticeship models, right? So all skill building happened through apprenticeship, where you could go and learn and be trained under someone who knows painting or someone who knows architecture or someone who knows metallurgy and so on. So they don't have to be textual in nature the way we think about it today, but they very much followed an apprenticeship model. This is an insight which is contestable, but I think it has some truth in it. That while there was a lot of standardization of knowledge, so even today, if you look at the Indian knowledge system corpus, and I know Matrushri gave an introduction to it yesterday about how it is organized, you will see that the knowledge is very, very well organized. It is not random or vague. But education was not always standardized. So you could learn many things. One could learn different things. And often it would differ based on who the expert you were learning from was. So it was very, very important who the guru was, who the acharya was, and what is the style and way in which they sought to teach. Which is why there are also, even in universities like Nalanda or Takshashila, it is believed that there were no standard exams that each student had to pass to graduate. Their teachers could essentially give them a notice of graduation when they believed that their education and understanding of the subject matter was complete. Similarly, we understand that living with the guru is considered essential for gaining knowledge. And this is also true in the university context. So the university, even though it had infrastructure, there were buildings, for instance. It was not like there were just classroom halls where everyone would go learn a lecture, get some learning, and come back. Oftentimes, students lived with their students even within the university premises and served them while they were learning there, right? So this model, of course, we know that it happened in the Gurukulas and the Pathshalas, which is your primary education. But some of these practices continue in your higher education also, because living with your teacher was considered a very important aspect in gaining knowledge as well. Moral education, as we have already discussed, was a very, very important core facet of learning. Interpersonal skills and life skills were also given a lot of importance. And this is where travel or those who were moving around with their students are a very good example. So there were several teachers or acharyas who were highly coveted, but they did not stay in one place, right? They moved around, and whenever they moved around, they took their students with them because they believed moving from place to place had a lot of learning and developmental benefits, which staying in one place could not. And then finally, as we saw with the example of the Ashokan edict, numeracy and accountancy as well as literacy were considered fairly basic skills for all. So you were not looking at a society which did not have primary literacy and numeracy skills. People had, one can infer fairly well from ancient Indian material evidence that numeracy and accountancy were fairly common skills. So we're exactly on half time, and I want to pause here and open the room for discussion and comments. What does everyone think? If you have some questions, what you found interesting, please unmute and tell us what you think. Any comments or thoughts from the room?
We were talking about the education, ancient Indian universities and especially Ujjaini, right? So all of us grew up listening to the stories of Vikramaditya. We have heard the Vikramadityas and the, Bhatti, his brother. So actually, they say Vikramarka Bhatti, Bhartrihari, who is famous for his Subhashitas, and Vararuchi, who is, what should I call him, the language expert. All of them are from Ujjaini. So that is where I was actually stuck, and I was thinking on those lines.
Could you repeat your question? Where were you stuck?
Yeah.
No, I'm just reflecting. That's it. I'm not asking any question.
Yeah, okay, wonderful.
Yes, madam. Yeah.
Madam, here interpersonal skills you had written, no? That in the bracket travel. What is the travel?
Right, here? Yes. So what I meant, why I have written travel in the bracket is that through travel a lot, the students also gain life skills. Because traveling either as part of education or even to gain education was not always easy. And travel in itself gives us ways to learn life skills. It helps us to take care of ourselves, to navigate different circumstances, to meet with and work with different kinds of people. These are also reasons why, it was understood that an Indian, even about 300 years ago, was far more multilingual than we are today. Because they traveled so much across the country that in order to survive, in order to navigate that travel, you would need to know many languages. You would need to know how to take care of your health. You would know how to live in very simple places, for example. So
Also to add to what you've already said, even when a student joins a Gurukula, the guru would send the students to go and collect alms from the nearby village. That would be the basic, the first step for navigating through difficult challenges and, teaching the basic life skills.
absolutely, Ji. Thank you so much for bringing that up. It's a very, very
Thank you.
important point because it was a Bhiksha model. What you learn is also that you are dependent on society, right? It also builds such a profound sense of gratitude in oneself to know that society has enabled a brahmachari or a student to learn for so very many years, and they are dependent on them for their living in many ways. So that is why travel, of course, life skills, and interpersonal skills come into play in a very simple way almost. Today, we need to take a separate class sometimes to teach interpersonal skills. Especially with COVID, we are seeing immense challenges with students not being able to socialize. Because so much education has become digital, it creates those boundaries which people are not so very easily able to break and converse with one another. So in such a model of education where travel is common, where going long distances is needed, where depending on others is very, very, it's almost the nature of life, right? Those skills are very naturally built.
Yes, madam. Yes, madam. Thank you. And through this exploration, one can understand everything. In addition to this numeracy and accountancy, the language skills also very important, like your reading and also that listening. Because nowadays that people are losing this listening skills. Because they are not willing to listen, and also without listening they are commenting. So the proper the lagging skills are behind. So that's why we need to impose on language skills along with this numeracy and accuracy. Thank you, madam. Very wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So literacy along with numeracy, yes, very, very crucial.
Another thing.
This one also NEP is talking about literacy and numeracy. No, ma'am. Every week they introduced like one period to talk with the children. So that is related to language lab actually.
And another beautiful contribution of this particular place called Takshasila is the Jataka tales. Giving beautiful morals and anecdotes and glimpses of life through small stories. That is another great contribution from that particular place.
Very true, very true. Wonderful. And I think you're right. NEP has tried to take several steps now in the right direction to bring language very importantly back and give it the importance it deserves in our education system. One small bit to add to the last point which was made around primary education and the role of stories, for example, is it was considered that in the Gurukulam, Gurukulam was not just for reading, writing, and learning formal disciplines, right? That would be a part of Shiksha or the formal education you receive. But it was also concerned with Shila. And Shila is what we can today understand as moral or virtual education. Virtual, not in the digital kind, virtual in the virtues kind, right? So what kind of virtues are we cultivating in children through education was given equal importance along with Shiksha. And the third was called Samadhi. So Samadhi is essentially about spiritual growth. And this tells us that even at the primary level, education was not just about skill building. Education was concerned, of course, with knowledge and formal learning. It was also concerned with moral development of the student. And then finally, the spiritual development of the student. All three, when we put together, that was the job of a Gurukulam or a Pathashala where students went to learn. Wonderful. So I have a few more slides left, and then I think we can come back to a larger discussion. Now, very briefly, I will touch upon Shushruta and Aryabhatta and some of the very famous. It's very difficult to find an English word for what one can call them because they're all rishis in their own right. So it's hard to say if they were educators or they were philosophers. So we will look very quickly, very briefly through what their contributions have been and how they survive. Right? Sages, great. Thank you, Shrikantji. Sages is a nice word. I think I will use it. So Sushruta, who is of course considered the father of surgery, also considered father of modern surgery, he was a pioneering physician. He's a pioneering figure in ancient Indian medicine, and his contributions have influenced so many different fields which we now look at in health and in advanced medicine, right? So surgery, and especially cosmic surgery and medical practices within the global community. He systematized an approach to surgery, which is very, very crucial because systematization, we'll come to that in a minute, why that is important. With the use of herbal anesthetics, so anesthesia, and post-operative care, right? So what is the care that one needs to take after or before even an operation or, an operation essentially takes place. And he laid the foundation for what are modern surgical practices today. The influence of his detailing surgical techniques and instruments. So he did not just create the techniques, he was also an inventor of many instruments which we today use in the world of surgery. And this extended beyond ancient India. It was not that what he devised or came up with stayed limited to India, but it spread across different parts of the world and shaped the development of reconstructive surgery, right? When injury or a particular accident or disease creates distortion. So we do reconstruction, orthopedics, ophthalmology, which has to do with the eyes, and many more fields. Flourishing. So where does Sushruta come from? So Sushruta essentially lived and studied in the historical town of Kashi. It is dated to be about 600 BC, although there are questions around this date. Sushruta's holistic technique to remedy encompassed an extensive range of fields consisting of surgery. So surgery was called Shalya Tantra, anatomy, beauty, and reconstruction, obstetrics and gynecology, ophthalmology. See, today these are all so many different disciplines within medicine, all of which he knew and several of whom he has changed for us today. He learned at what was then called the Gurukul of Dhanvantari in the city of Kashi. Now, very quickly, I want you to pay attention and look at these two figures. So these on the left, these are called yantras. So yantras are basically of 6 types, and these are blunt instruments. So they are not sharp. They cannot be used for incision, but they are used for very many other things, right? They are used, for example, for dissection. Some are tube-like in nature. Some are used for, are used as accessories. So even when you are making incisions, you need something to, for example, hold open flesh so that you can essentially make incisions inside the body and so on. So both these plates, essentially the left side diagram are the yantras which were essentially invented by Sushruta. And on the right side are shastras. So shastras were considered sharp instruments which could create cuts and incisions of different types, right? Could be used for different parts of the body, inside or outside, all of which were invented by him. And along with the invention of these instruments, right? So when we say invention, you can imagine, right? One would be the very, very deep knowledge of the human body itself. But second would also be knowledge of metallurgy, knowledge of casting, knowledge of materials which will help you understand what kind of material can be used to make these particular instruments, right? Very interesting. If you carefully observe, so many of them we actually use even to this day, or we use an adapted version of these instruments even to this day. He also came up, for example, there are so many types of scissors on the right side. You would have seen these in a hospital or even in your local physician's clinic when you have gone for a visit and so on. So many of these, along with the invention of these instruments, there were, of course, several techniques of surgical techniques which Sushruta is said to have invented. And many modern day common practices, for example, you applying anesthesia, or what helps us disinfect and keep a wound clean, right? Even those practices are very well mentioned in the Sushruta Samhita. Right? So this gives us a very quick understanding or a quick snapshot of how advanced those knowledge techniques would be to produce even a person like Sushruta. Not that he was without his challenges during his lifetime, because several times opening or cutting or working with corpses was considered not very good during that time. So Sushruta had to very much work against that particular bias in society to try and experiment and create these advances in modern medicine. Similarly, we will very quickly look at Aryabhatta and mathematics, right? Aryabhatta is very commonly known because of the ISRO and the satellite which was launched, and quite well that it paid due respects to Aryabhatta, named after him. But otherwise, we have very little understanding of what his contribution to mathematics was, right? So Aryabhatta has given his work, which is the Aryabhatiya and Aryabhatta Siddhanta. These are the two very important mathematical texts which we get from Aryabhatta. Okay. So Aryabhatiya has 4 padas in it, which is Ganita Pada, Geetika Pada, right? Gola Pada and Kalakriya Pada. Now, all these padas in themselves have specific areas of focus, right? And the Aryabhatiya itself is actually a very, very advanced work of mathematics and astronomy. In fact, there has been a continuing tradition of mathematical knowledge in India, which goes up to roughly I think, the 14th or 15th century, after which we do not have mathematicians who are following that line. Which is why you will see that the work of the Kerala School of Mathematicians, as well as professors such as Ramasubramaniam ji in IIT Bombay, is trying to revive and reread and interpret these texts and follow forward and take forward this very important branch of Indian mathematics, right? But Aryabhatta is one of, again, a very long line of mathematicians which have existed in ancient India, and we have accounts of them through different texts. A lot of their texts thankfully continue to survive and are available to us. Many, of course, are lost to time, but even those that exist are waiting for people to study and interpret them. So Vara Mihira, who is a polymath in his own right, has several texts, including the Pancha Siddhantika, right? It is believed that there were about 18 Siddhantas which were composed, sorry. So Siddhantic texts are essentially systems of work that capture theories and principles about various astronomical phenomena, right? It's a theoretical principle-based text, and it gives us computation to the tune of the Mahayugas. Mahayugas are very, very large periods of time, right? So among those 18 Siddhantas in astronomy, it is said that today, because of Vara Mihira's compilation of 5 of them, only 5 are available to us. The rest are lost to time. And these 5 which are compiled together are called the Pancha Siddhanta. But this is a very quick hat tip almost to the greatness of the mathematical tradition which existed in India. Of course, we only hear that it is the zero, that zero was invented in India and so on. But that is more like a certain kind of pop fiction that we know. We actually have fairly less understanding of how the mathematical tradition existed, how advanced it was, what were its pedagogical methods, what was the number system which that was followed, and what were the different kinds of strides in mathematics and astronomy that ancient Indian mathematicians. Now, similarly, so I've tried to take very quick glimpses of three great sages who are known to be great in three very different things, right? So first we saw Shushruta, known to be very great in medicine, continuing impact of his inventions in the field of medicine. And then we very quickly saw Aryabhatta and mathematics. Now, finally coming to Kautilya's Arthashastra, which again is from the ancient period, right? Arthashastra is probably one of the most popular texts that has been written and rewritten so many times, right? Today, you will also have life or business principles based on the Arthashastra and so on. So, who is Kautilya? Kautilya or Chanakya is the kingmaker of Chandragupta Maurya. He essentially helps and aids Chandragupta take over the empire in Magadha with Pataliputra as its capital from Dhanananda, who he believed was carrying forward unjust rule. And so he aids a very young Chandragupta Maurya and helps him establish a kingdom or the Maurya dynasty, which lasts for a very long time. Right? But the Arthashastra particularly is a treatise on statecraft, on politics, on economic policy and military strategy, right? All very, very important if we were to think about a king. So just the way, just the way you teach someone who's going to be a physician all the medical sciences, the idea of the Arthashastra was to teach Chandragupta Maurya, who was the reigning king at that time, all these different aspects which were very important to ruling his kingdom efficiently. Right? The Arthashastra is roughly dated to have been written around 1st to 3rd century CE and has been found. We found it in several fragments. So there have been many historical attempts to compile it and bring it together in one single place. Right. The principal focus of the political sections of the Arthashastra is the means of kingship. Right. And how essentially a ruler should comport himself. That's very much the core of this particular text. So true kingship is defined as a ruler's subordination of his own desires and ambitions to do the good for his people. And that's very important because in a certain way, Kautilya believed that Dhanananda will be an unjust ruler because he will always keep his desires at the front and not the welfare of his people. Similarly, one of the highest roles or fit the ability to be a good king, which Kautilya describes, is in the idea of the Rajarishi, right? That and what he defines what a Rajarishi or who a Rajarishi is. So Rajarishi, according to him, has, quote, self-control and does not fall for the temptation of the senses. So Indriya Vijaya is a very important idea even for a king, according to Kautilya. He learns continuously. He has to continually be trained. He can't say, oh, I have learned enough. Now I will rule, I will not learn. Right? So learns continuously and cultivates his thoughts. Very cultivated person. Right? He avoids false and flattering advisors. Does not surround himself with people who could be telling him falsehood or who could be trying to flatter him because he is the king. He genuinely promotes the security and welfare of his people. Very, very important. He enriches and empowers his people. So enriching, which is why it is called Arthashastra, that whatever is the Artha that is sought, this Shastra helps you achieve or gain that particular Artha. Right? And so the security, welfare, and prosperity of the people is considered to be a very important goal, which a king should keep in mind. Which is why in the Arthashastra, Kautilya will also say that a king must avoid war at all costs till he cannot avoid it. Why should he avoid war? Because it is only in peace time that people will have prosperity, abundance, and can achieve their dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. They cannot do so during wartime, for instance. He lives a simple life. Think about it. Which sort of kingmaker will tell his king that you ought to live a simple life and avoids harmful people or activities? So don't do things which are harmful or bad in nature. So the book 1 and book 2 of the Arthashastra discusses how the crown prince or whoever is going to become the heir next should be trained and how the king himself should continue learning, selecting his key mantris, who are his officials, administration, staffing of the court personnel, magistrates, and judges. Of course, this is a very famous quotation, which is why I bring it here, where it says, "In the happiness of his subjects lies the king's happiness. In their welfare, his welfare. He shall not consider as good only that which pleases him, but treat as beneficial to him whatever pleases his subjects." This has come down to us as a very important part of thinking about kingship, about Raj Dharma in some ways, right? In the happiness of the subjects lies the happiness of the king. Now, the preservation and advancement of the good of the people or the good of the subjects was actually comprised of 7 vital elements according to the Arthashastra, right? Or 7 things make up the constituents or are the constituents of what the king is supposed to pay attention to. Of course, it is him, he who serves the people, but also ministers and councillors serve the king. Farmlands and countrysides, which provides the resources for any kingdom to flourish. Fortresses. So fortresses are essentially for security, right? They protect resources and extended controls of empires at that particular time. The treasury maintained government-funded expansion. So the artha in the particular kingdom. Military security essentially helped defend the state and expand it. And then finally, allies, right? Potential enemies who could be made friends to achieve common goals. And these 7 things, according to Kautilya, are very important and must always be thought of and worked on, strategized by the king to ensure the well-being of. If you think about it, so much of our modern foreign policy or even international politics has some of these common elements, right? Today, we think about appointments to, let's say, the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. We want good people to essentially be part of those political positions. We want increased security to help keep our country and its people safe. And then, of course, we think about resources in a very, very different way as well. So while a lot of our thinking around international politics also has expanded over time, Kautilya gives us very important or very interesting ways to think about how a king ought to rule, as well as how should he maintain relationships with other sort of kingdoms. In fact, a lot of Indian researchers in the last few decades have done research on what could be a foreign policy that follows some of Kautilya's principles. And if you are interested, I'll be happy to share some of those readings with you later. And now towards our discussion section, I just want to open up a question that we have such a rich heritage, which we've just covered in the last 1 hour, very, very quickly, just touching the surface of what ancient India had in terms of both knowledge as well as education. So why do we look down on Indian education today? What are the challenges today that some of you as educators are facing, especially in articulating this very glorious past?
Ma'am, I would like to say that our Indian education system mostly now is like a rote memory to the children and not practical oriented, which is challenging to
every teacher, I believe. And there are many things need to be updated with regard to the education system, and also personally the management of every institute to take initiative regarding this. And I also believe every teacher must actively participate in bringing up practical oriented sessions. It's not just to be like a curriculum based or a book based system. It should not be limited to one particular book. That is the main reason. And even we need support from the parents also.
Absolutely. So we don't need to depend on such centralized, standardized, just very singular ways in which we learn. We can learn from so many different things and in many variety of ways. Definitely need to involve parents, as we saw that community was a very central part of ancient Indian education, right?
And home is the first learning center for a child.
Absolutely.
And parents are the role models. And second learning center is certainly the school, wherein practically whatever we are learning in as a teacher educator is not being implemented over there. We need support from the management also. Although we learn many things as a teacher educator here, when we enter into an institution, there are many things which are deviated, which are not being practically applied there for various reasons.
Yes, absolutely.
And for that reason, we need support from the management to a teacher for the upliftment of the child.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Thank you.
Whenever
Sapnaji.
we look into our Indian education, actually, when we start looking towards the Woods Dispatch, especially, they have followed. They have that model clearly states that it followed inverted filtration, downward filtration approach. What they have done is they first trained the higher class to follow the British education standards. What this was created is actually at the time Indian society used to suffered a lot, and they wanted upliftment of the strata.
Mobility.
We start seeing the social strata, especially in the when people are trying to chasing that, actually while chasing, they have internalized that English is the one of the superior language. वैसा करते करते हुए they are internalized it, and that is the final result we are facing right now. And actually, when if you look at the South Korea model, especially, they are they're highly focused on their language. Starting right from the signboards, whatever it may be. And sadly, India is the only nation where even though a person has zero knowledge by speaking English, he is considered as a more dignified and highly educated. But in countries like there are also certain Asian countries like China, Japan, etc., we can't even distinguish the English and Japanese slang actually. But our Nigerian president recently had in a meeting has said that some of the country indigenized the it has indigenized the technology from the British, but not culture. That's why it succeeded.
Very important for us to think about what role Indian languages play in our own development. And I
Yes,
think
ma'am.
teachers, we are all thinking about that question. Very correctly, you pointed out, and I saw that the colonial model was talked about yesterday a little bit.
Although
Go ahead.
Although, excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Although most of the states has given importance to the regional language, yet people are not forgetting the rote memory what they have been what it was caused during the independence time. Because as said by someone previously who spoke before me, India is very much influenced by the foreign languages. Of course, I do accept with this. English is a business language which is very important to communicate, and at the same time, it is giving a false impression that someone who is good at English is well versed and knowledgeable person, and that is okay to some extent. Communication is really so important, but the thing is, it has gone to that extent that people have forgotten the difference between modernization and westernization. They have got influenced very much that they have forgotten our civilization, and they are just following the culture, but not the education which is being given by which is being given from the ancient India.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Any other comments on around this point, or what you thought was interesting about ancient India and education? What are some elements you think you would want to bring into your own practice as an
Actually,
educator?
I think is, ma'am, even though current education system is somewhat satisfying, but if one can subtract capitalism from the current education system, we can also extend by integrating the Indian knowledge system and also current knowledge system. We can witness the vast sea of knowledge, ma'am. Actually,
If
especially
we go back,
capitalism is
to the, can
as
I?
okay. Carry on, carry on.
So if we go back to the ancient Indian education system, we see there are two broad categories, the Paravidya and Aparavidya, and there is Shreyas and there is Preyas. They said if you are considering the well-being of the whole humanity is for Shreyas, and if it is something that is concerned only with you, that is called Preyas. So we are focusing more on the Preyas aspect, and we are totally forgetting the Shreyas aspect. If we try to bring back that Shreyas aspect into education, I think that would be more than enough. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
that.
one more thing I believe is, implementation of Vedas and knowledge of Vedas and as a part of curriculum may some extent be may bring some change, like from the pre-primary itself. If we implement like stotras and shlokas, and not just only with rote memory, but Bhagavad Gita and all these along with the summary, we should make the child learn the importance of knowledge of Vedas, so that by the time they come into teenage, they will get to know some idea about all these things. But where is that in? I haven't seen any of the school. I think hardly only in Gurukulas it is implemented. In no other school this is implemented.
Absolutely. Which is why
This
I
may
think
bring
it's
some change.
wonderful. Absolutely. Which is why I think it's wonderful that we are doing this session and we are all exploring some bit of, Indian knowledge systems through this. But I think what all of you have said, I just want to take 5 more minutes very quickly and talk about a very important thing that we are all in different ways saying. We are saying the same thing, but in through very different perspectives. We all understand and accept the fact that today we are living through, or we are having an education system which is deeply impressed upon and carried forward by the colonial mode of education. So the changes to our education system, along with the economic decline that India faced and its institutions withered because of this particular idea, the way of approaching education, right down to how do we define a school, the fact that it should have X amount of land, the fact that it should have buildings, the fact that, it is more about infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily focus just on the teaching learning process, or the fact that private education is becoming expensive. Some of these challenges are actually a result of the colonial policies of education, which we have all discussed and looked at yesterday. So that brings us to a very important realization, including language, right? Language remains a big question when it comes to learning, right? How do we make sure that there is more regional language learning that happens, that Indians themselves learn more Indian languages? That's a huge point of, discussion among many, many educators. That brings us to this idea of decolonizing education, right? That education in India today suffers from many, many challenges that all of you have pointed out. These challenges range from language to the infrastructure needs of a school to how it's become very rote learning focused. It does not have many live or skill-based, life-based elements into it. And then also that it has become sometimes very almost antagonistic to the Indian knowledge systems or any sort of indigenous knowledge system. So we understand that all across the world before modernity, there were different indigenous knowledge systems, right? The Maoris in Australia, India, of course, had so many of them. You can't even give it a singular name. In many ways, when we talk about IKS, they are all indigenous knowledge systems which were sidelined during the colonial period. So in the colonial period, you are no longer learning Ayurveda. You are forced to learn medicine as is defined by the West. Similarly, you are no longer learning, mathematics, which is Indian mathematics or Ganita, but you are forced to learn what is modern mathematics, which is fairly different. So this brings us to the question of what is decoloniality. And this is a very complicated definition. And I will not go very much into it. But decoloniality, India is a decolonized country, which means politically we are free. We have political freedom for ourselves, and that we gained in 1947. But decoloniality, which means is our way of thinking, of being today as Indians, free from colonial impact? Is it free from colonial impressions? Is it free from the colonial baggage which we carried for a long time when we were ruled by the British? Right? So the decoloniality itself means that we free ourselves of the way of thinking in the way that was imposed upon us. That we find our own ground in the kind of knowledge and practices which are Indian by nature. Because before, it was not that before colonization, we were a primitive people who had no history, no geography, we had no sciences, we had no architecture. That is simply not true. Today's session, we've already seen in a very quick manner, we have gotten an understanding of the different kinds of knowledge systems, skills, and practices which ancient India was full of. It was a very vibrant culture. Thousands of years later, we cannot come back to an understanding that, in pre-colonial times, we were primitive and savages who needed education. Right? So, very simply put, decoloniality is a way for us to relearn the knowledge which has been pushed aside. So, this knowledge was sidelined, right? When you create an educational policy which says only British or only English education of this particular kind will be taught in India, it means that the knowledge which existed was systematically decentered. It was forgotten. Quite a fair bit of it perhaps was forgotten. It was buried, right? Or discredited by the faces of modernity. So whenever we hear about, oh, this is not valid, when you talk about, let's say, an ancient Indian manuscript or text and try to make an argument, people say, oh, this is not valid because modern science tells us this. That is why Vata Pitta Kapha is not a valid way of knowing one's body, for example, right? That is discreditation by the forces of modernity, settler colonialism, or racial capitalism. This process of decolonizing education is something that all of us, as we go through not just IKS, but as teachers in India, teaching children from different parts of this country, right? We all have to be very actively engaged in this process. It means we have to relearn our own knowledge. We have to think more deeply about what is our theory of knowledge. What are the methods which go with that theory of knowledge, right? What makes this knowledge valid, and how do we teach and learn it? So, for example, you will see so many Gurukulams still follow a verbal form of learning far more than the written. Of course, they write also. But why do they do that? They don't do that because there was no paper, for example, or some strange reason like that, but because that is a pedagogical method considered very important in the Indian knowledge systems. Right? Similarly, how do we become non-Eurocentric? Right? How do we bring back practices of our indigenous knowledge and culture back into our education? And I will close this particular session on this particular slide, right? This, if you look at it, if you look at education or knowledge from a philosophical perspective, this is actually a very important diagram. At the foundation of what we consider knowledge, of what we consider science, of what we consider the way of seeing the world, is called our philosophy, our epistemology and ontology. Right? It's our philosophical basis that tells us what is knowledge to us, what is the nature of being for us. Right? How do we string these together into a worldview? So when we look at the world, are we seeing the world through our philosophical lens, or are we seeing the world from someone else's philosophical or some other philosophical lens? That is the foundational question we have. Based on this foundation are the questions of what we define as science and social science, or your fields of learning, right? Based on your philosophical system, we set the rules of the game. We create limits of permissibility, strands of logic, and narrative and normative claims. So tomorrow, if, for example, somebody comes to you and somebody who only believes in allopathy and believes Ayurveda is wrong, will constantly tell you that there is no scientific basis for Vata, Pitta, Kapha. That means that modern medicine today has defined what scientific knowledge is. And it has also defined what medicine and biology is. It has defined a singular way of understanding the human body and its well-being, right? So when you say, oh, there is Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and this person is having a cold because their Kapha is high, for example, it is outside of what they consider the realm of science, which means that we are still arguing within their limits of the game. You will never win that argument because Ayurveda will always look unscientific according to that paradigm. What this means is we must build our own paradigms, we must build our own philosophy and our own knowledge of what is health and well-being, right? Which stems from the Indian knowledge systems, which comes from a very long tradition of people doing medical practice. So through that, we create what are methods of doing knowledge, right? And then finally, after this second stage, on top is law, policy, and innovation, right? So innovation, which means what is new? What are your textbooks made of? What are the new kinds of things, or even very simple lab experiments that students do in the classroom, right? Innovation will result from the foundational worldview and what it cherishes. So what we want, somebody brought on the beautiful point about Shreyas and Preyas, right? That is about what this worldview values inherently. And policy and law will also then follow that particular idea of Shreyas and Preyas, or that particular worldview, which is the foundation of all knowledge. I know this might be very quickly heavy-set sort of thing towards the end, but this is a very quick understanding which is important for all of us. Otherwise, many times we get stuck in the third layer. We are always saying, oh, policy needs to make this change, right? We want governments to do this. We want administrations to do this. Of course, and those are all important steps. But very foundationally, as Indians, as educators, as teachers who might be engaging in Indian knowledge systems, we need to ourselves cultivate an Indian or an IKS based worldview from which the plants of all these other activities and actions will emerge. I will pause there and we have a few minutes for questions and discussion.
Oh, just to talk about Vata, Pitta and Kapha, you don't even need doctors. If you can sit with your grandmother holding her hand, no, she will just look at you and tell you what exactly is your problem and what kind of Ayurvedic you have to take. All we are doing is, all we are failing to do is document their experiences. If we start documenting their experiences, that would, I guess, would become a repertory of knowledge.
Wonderful point. Yes. So this knowledge exists today also. It's not lost. Our grandmothers, our grandparents have it. And we need to find a way not just to document it, but also find ways to tell your child or the youngest person in your family to learn from it and not think that that is hocus pocus while something else is, the right way of healing oneself. Just as an example. But thank you for that point.
Namaste, Andi Dikshita garu.
Namaste.
This is Lalita. Actually, all these things what we are listening to and trying to, reinvent and know about all this. But the problem, what we teachers face is the new generation's orientation towards life, where we are unable to, even sensitize them towards the kind of, what we want to really rejuvenate the Indian knowledge systems, because they are totally into the technological world. And how to bring them back to our, I don't say, we have to control them but how to really sensitize them. Because if you understand Telugu, I think మనకి ఇప్పుడు గ్రౌండ్ లెవెల్ ఎలా ఉందంటే చాప కింద నీరు లాగా మొత్తం మెటీరియలిస్టిక్ orientation is almost encompassing the whole community and also especially the youngest generation, what you spoke about now. So really, bringing them back to the roots and teaching them the basic elements of ethics and character is a real difficult task for the teachers. So almost all the secondary schools and classrooms have become counseling rooms than content teaching, because they don't need any more content nowadays. It is available for them, and information is, because of science and technology, you can get it anywhere and everywhere, but not the values.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we don't speak religion in the classrooms. We don't speak any of this, Indian pedagogies in the classroom. So this is the biggest challenge for us.
Thank you for sharing that.
Please, you can
very
comment.
much empathize with you on this particular point. And as someone who works in technology policy, I myself do this. And we do a fair bit of work where we try to help young people think about technology in better ways. I agree with you. We are in an information age where all information is available. But I think we will increasingly realize, as many are realizing, that information is not knowledge. It never was. So we are looking at young people who are overexposed technologically, and what they encounter in their information environment online, let's say, that becomes their world. Now, a very simple way of thinking about this is, what should they be surrounded by? If they are surrounded by and this has to start early on because technological interventions are fairly early these days. Parents hand kids to their phones when they turn 3 or 4, which I think itself is not very healthy for their development. But what I mean to say through this is what kind of content, knowledge, and people exposure are we giving to children from their young age? Still makes a huge difference. And within those, also teaching them inherently the limits of technology. It's something, it's a zeitgeist we should also not fall into, right? If we use the phone for 8 hours a day, you can't expect a child to do nothing. So I think it's a very complicated question, and perhaps the biggest question that all educators and parents are dealing with right now. But there is, I think that the only direction this is essentially heading into is us looking back at Indian knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems worldwide to find more sanity in a world where where technology is just making content available to us all the time. I also personally don't think that we can say inherently younger people are more materialistic. It's essentially about what environment they grew up in and what sort of values have they absorbed through tech, through schools, through peer groups, etc. So the media influence is definitely something that needs to be thought about.
This is Dr. Sunita. I think one of the most important thing is here, I think, because you're talking about decolonization. I think this part, I think which should be parent education is more important here. And I think gadgets usage of gadgets, and then I think there are other factors, materialistic life people are having. I think this is because of various factors, like disintegration of joint family system. Yeah, because in joint family, we used to have like the grandparents with us. I still remember when you were talking about the medicines for constipation and all those things. We used to just make kashayam and then drink. That was the relief. Or just it was hot water. So I think nowadays children also, the way you tell our children, I think it is the responsibility of the parents. We need not talk about disintegration of joint family system, increase in literacy rate, employment, dual role played by the mother and father, lack of time. I think more than the quantity of time you're spending with your children, I think it is quality of time you're spending with the child is more important. And the point here is the number of hours the parents outside the house, the same number of our children are also out. Right? So when the child is not at home, mother also, she can't teach anything to the child. I think the quality of time when the mother or father with the child, I think we have got knowledge from our ancestors, grandparents and all. I think it is our responsibility, whether you're a teacher or whether you're a mother or a father, like we should know the ways and means, every time, wherever we find time, chance to teach our students in the classroom or as parents to our children, I think we have time. It's only the thought process has been changed. So this, I think, because all the teacher educators who are on this platform are also parents and grandparents. So I think we should take it as our responsibility how to transmit this knowledge to a thing. When you're showing that Shushruta, whatever the instruments you are shown, they're all now used in surgical procedures. The cross, scissors, the way the stitches, the needle and the thread, all of them are there. There is no change. There might be a slight modification, the preparation of the metal or the finishing you give. Those are only the differences. So we are almost following the same tradition, what we are transmitted from our forefathers or ancestors. But how do you perceive it? How do you implement in your day-to-day life? I think if you give little bit of thinking on that aspect, I think as teacher educator, as parents, I think we can retain our things. And I think this is the right initiation taken by Government of India to implement Indian knowledge system into a thing. And early in the morning, I think if we keep our Vishnu Sahasranamas or Ganapati Stotras and Lalita Sahasranamam, and then Veda Ashirvachanam early in the morning in the house, I think automatically that vibrations and that positivity will be taken up by our children and our grandchildren in the. So these are the few practices if you really follow in a house. Like even because we are all teacher educators, we can tell our trainees, and these trainees in turn they go and tell in the classroom. Like there is a saying: if you teach one, that person will teach 10. So it need not be restricted to our own Hindu, all the religion. See, in Muslim religion, children they compulsory pray for 4 times. So I think that has become an habit. I think even that fear concept is also losing in the present generation. Who is like that kind of attitude is being developed. So why it is being developed? Somebody told in the initial stage of the lecture, parents are the first teacher, family is the first school. So when we know everything, but still we are not practicing. So where is the lack? I think it is within us. So we have to change whatever the governmental Indian knowledge system, indigenous system, everything they're doing so much of work, but we are not practicing it. So the practicing should go with the parents, teachers, then only the children and the next generation we pass. So, for example, when we are doing, the child is having cold. So we make, drink pepper milk, it will cure. Turmeric escon. So, you're protecting your child health and we are using the indigenous method and boost your immunity. So these kind of things, even the mother is a MBBS doctor or a scientist, whatever it is, we have to follow the first steps and then go to the higher level of allopathy medicine. So if this thought process change, I think definitely we can go back to decolonization. That concept was really good, which I really liked it. Getting things from what is already buried. So it is there. It is not lost forever. Like, 18 Pancha Siddhantas, out of 18, 5 were existing. So with that 5, I think we can go what 8 things we have lost. Like not 8, almost 13 we lost.
Yeah.
So it will give us change. So I think these kind of attitudinal changes should come in the teacher and the parents so that we will be able to transmit this to our next generation. I think these things have to be kept in mind, and this is what we have to learn from this platform. Like, whatever the government policies, whatever changes we do in the curriculum or anything, but when it should go to the next generation through parents and the teachers. That is more important. That's what teacher educators and parent education is more important in order to pass this Indian knowledge system to our next generation. Thank you. I think taken a lot of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunita. I think that's a wonderful message to end this session on. You've summarized essentially the key things that we ought to do. I agree. I think there is a lot here. The very small contribution I wanted to make through this session is share with all of us that there is so much knowledge, there is so much information, and across so much time, we still have a plethora of knowledge available to us in the Indian knowledge systems, and we all have to be teachers and learners at the same time. We have to learn what we might have forgotten, because all of us also have somewhere gone through that modern educational process, right? So we have to make those investments ourselves, as well as find ways to share this knowledge, document it, as well as find ways to communicate it in ways that work with the next generation. So thank you so much.
I want to add it. Like, nowadays, there are a lot of things going on with respect to Garbha Sanskars. There's recently I've come across one study. The children, when the mother is expecting, and if you do this Garbha Sanskar like Havan and listening to all these mantras and chanting and all, the children born are really very peaceful, and they are really, happy children they are, and these kind of things they have found where when the mother is when the child is in the womb itself, when we do all these things, the child born is also like, with all that spirituality, peaceful and happy. All these things have been identified. They have given around certain 20 or 21 characteristics. They were really
21.
It was an experimental study. It was really great. Like, these kind of things, I think we have to follow, and we lack of time. I don't know what, but still we can find time to do all these things. And then I think we have to go back to a thing, and so that we lead a peaceful life. Like, when we were young, we did not had this competition, tuitions, and all those things. So that time when we go to tuition, for example, children are not there with the gadgets, right? So that time when we were not going to tuitions, like if we are taking up a tuition means that child is a moddu or a failure. So we were never into the tuition. That time we used to spend playing outside. So, but what parents now, they are scared to send them outside, and they're just giving gadgets. The child is not eating food, giving the gadgets. So let him not eat, but don't give the gadgets. So these kind of principles, if you strictly follow, we all listen to our parents. So why don't we make our children take good things from us? With these kind of things, I think we can do a lot of changes. I think this is one of the things which we have to practice as teachers and the parents. Thank you. My colleague Durgesham wants to speak, add on to this something.
Yeah. Yeah, Namaste, madam. This is Durgesham from the Department of Education. Really, you made an attempt, wonderful, madam, regarding. So, through your first, the title of your slide, that is a glimpses into that ancient Indian system. Really, its motives us to understand the sisters of all the across the people of India. So the Shishtacharas always is a route to learn many things, as our the Professor Sunita Madam says and Lalita Madam says, and also participants Gomati Madam and Swapna and Mohan and all, they reveal really. So that shows you connected the sisters through Vaishishta, your name. I take that. Why sister? Yes, why sisters? So it is a very important to learn. It is the need of the hour to inculcate among the young prodigies through this education. So maybe that is the reason why the Dr. Raju used to say that we need to bring back the right book of the beautiful tree into our curriculum process. So really, with this, we express our that. Heartful thanks to you to bring, and also your kind, all these great, the souls and spirits, the great warriors of Indian knowledge system among the teacher education colleges across Telangana. We have so far 5 universities. The 5 university representatives are participated today. Really, you made an attempt. Wonderful. Thank you on behalf of this education Department of Education, and we are expressing our sincere thanks to you, madam. Thank you. And all the participants, we express our sincere thanks to on behalf of the Department of Education, Osmania University. And also we expect the same and same live, this kind of live interaction, which will be lead to develop that right knowledge to be practiced in the forthcoming phases. Thank you so much, and warm welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. If I may quickly end with a small invocation before we close the session.
Okay.
Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu.
लोकाः समस्ताः सुखिनो भवन्तु। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। ॐ श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः। हरिः ॐ।
Thank you, ma'am.
everyone.
All the teacher educators and the students, tomorrow again we'll have the session at 2 o'clock. Starts from 2. I think kindly all of you motivate the rest of the fraternity, students fraternity and the teacher educators to join us. These are really interesting lectures which we are having. So, madam, tomorrow we'll have around 2 o'clock, 2 to 4, we'll have another session tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you all participants on YouTube and